working. Breach means, is that okay? Breach means something that is broken. It is easy to build. It is far more difficult to rebuild. The first 3 chapters of the Bible are about creating, building. The next chapters, all the chapters of Genesis, and in fact the rest of the book of the Bible, is about rebuilding. Rebuilding was far more difficult because it involved the death of the Son of God. So you can see how rebuilding is an extremely difficult process, and how we need to pay attention to what God is saying about rebuilding in the book of Isaiah. We are people who are interested in mission, and mission is about rebuilding. Rebuilding the nation, rebuilding the church, rebuilding ourselves, our lives, and our families. So we have a template, a prototype of rebuilding in several chapters of the New Testament, and I'm hoping to give you an overview of how to do that. All the verses that we read this morning were all about rebuilding. Isaiah and Chronicles was about rebuilding the nation of Israel. Acts was about rebuilding the church. It says, rebuild David's fallen tent, even with the Gentiles. That means it was rebuilt including the Gentiles, not simply the Jews. And finally, in John, it is about rebuilding each individual. It says, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, what was broken in the nation of Israel? Everything was broken. First of all, it started with the breaking up of the temple. The temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar's army, and then the nation was destroyed. The houses and the streets and the people were taken exile, and they were taken slaves to the land of Babylon. And finally, the wall was burnt and destroyed. So the 3 things were destroyed: the temple, the city, and the wall. And we are going to see how to rebuild these 3 things and what God did to rebuild Jerusalem. Jerusalem was completely razed from the map. It did not exist after Nebuchadnezzar and after the Assyrian and the Babylonian invasion. The Jews who were not enslaved ran helter-skelter to the neighboring countries, to Phoenicia, to Syria, to Egypt, and some of them have gone to Crete and Cyprus. And a few old people who could not walk were left behind, and the rest were enslaved and were in the land of Babylon. So officially, Israel did not exist. But in 70 years' time, everything came back, and it was actually a great historical, cultural miracle. How did God do this? And so we will see that, because it is going to be the template for us in rebuilding our nation and the church. First of all, I'm going to give you a summary of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the context. What is the context in which it was broken? Why was it broken? And then how was it rebuilt? So I'll give you the context. And then I'm saying that God is the real author and coordinator of the rebuilding, but He included people and leaders in the process. Even today, God is really the leader of mission work, but we have to cooperate with God in actually helping with the rebuilding process. And then I'm going to tell you about how it involved a lot of suffering. And then I'm going to talk about the silence of God. The book of Isaiah starts off with the silence of God. The people are saying, we have been fasting and we have been putting on sackcloth, and we've been praying, but you've not been answering. What's happening? And then Isaiah gives a reply. And so I'm going to tell you about why God was silent. And so the context, first of all, of Isaiah 58. The context involves understanding what happened before the exile, during the exile, and after the exile. There were pre-exilic prophets, there were exilic prophets, and there were post-exilic prophets. Isaiah here was a pre-exilic prophet. He lived about 100 years before the exile. And so he is actually doing preventive counseling. He is telling them, if you continue doing this, then this will happen. He tells them, Amos, he was also a pre-exilic, he tells them, you've been sacrificing your children to Molech. You know, in Samaria they had built a temple and they were worshipping Molech, and they were giving the children into the belly of this god where there was a fire. And when they sacrificed the child, the priest would drum up and increase the noise so that they cannot hear the cries of the child. And then in Ezekiel it says, you don't even care for your parents, you don't care for the people in your family, you don't care for the alien, the widow and the orphan. And then in Jeremiah it says, from top to the bottom, every one of you are absolutely corrupt. Now that was the context. And then Isaiah says, you are just becoming richer and richer, you are adding house to house, till you have a huge house, but you alone are living in it. And we find that today. And then Isaiah again says, you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. In Jeremiah it says, woe to him who builds his palace by unrighteousness and his upper rooms without justice. You make your countrymen serve without pay and to fail to pay their wages. And post-exilic times, even after the exile, poor people, when they came back, they had to mortgage their lands to be able to get food, and they had to sell their children as slaves to be able to pay the mortgage. And the priests and the princes had become utterly corrupt, and they had become idolaters. And so death and destruction followed. I've already told you, the temple was destroyed, the city walls were broken, the city itself was destroyed, and everybody was taken as slaves. Is there any hope at all for Israel? And we can learn from this because there is a parallel in our own country. The church in India is broken. All the church institutions are broken. There are schools and hospitals. There is inequality and poverty. There is injustice in our country. There is violence. And there is family breakdown. The same things that existed at that time exist today in our country. And this is what God tells Isaiah in chapter 58, which was read. It says, if you, that means if the people of God, not everybody else, if you, that means the church in India, if they, not prime ministers, not chief ministers, not the politicians, he's saying if the church in India, you break the chains of injustice, if you feed the hungry and clothe the naked, if you look after your own flesh and blood, if you give shelter to the poor, if you break the yoke of oppression, if you develop a relationship with God, and if you do what is right in God's sight, then the night will become like noonday. You will be like a well-watered garden, a spring that never fails, and you will rebuild the ancient ruins. So this is the context in which these things happen. So now we want to see how God actually rebuilt, and because we can learn from that. First of all, God gives them encouragement. He says, yes, you are completely dead. Israel does not exist. And you are like dry bones, but do you think I can, Son of Man, he tells Ezekiel, do you think I can rebuild Israel? And Ezekiel says, Lord, you know. And these dead bones become a well-oiled army. And so we can also believe that God can rebuild this nation if the church does the things that were mentioned. So what are the strategies that God used to rebuild? These are the 5 things God did. First of all, he spoke through 15 prophets. 4 major prophets, 3 historical prophets, and 8 minor prophets. He spoke words of warning. He told them what you're doing is wrong. He spoke words of wisdom, saying, please do this. And he spoke words of encouragement, saying, if you do this, then you will be like a well-watered garden. And then this is what he told them about the sins. He warned them and he gave them words of comfort. And then he provided all the resources. He provided them with permission. They were given letters of permission so that they could go and rebuild. They made edicts that were put down and written down. And then they provided them with gold and silver and money so that they could rebuild. They provided them wood and help from the army so that they could continue with the rebuilding process. So God provided all the needed resources. So also we can believe that God will provide the resources that we need to rebuild. And then God helped them manage the enemies. First of all, foreign wives had come, and a lot of them had turned to idolatry, and Ezra was able to manage that. There was the Sanballat and Tobiah. They were the Samaritans who disturbed the building of the temple, building of the wall, and they were managed. There was Haman, who wanted to ethnically cleanse the Jews, and Esther helped manage that. And then God raised up 4 important leaders, actually 5, Zerubbabel and Joshua the first time, Esther behind the scenes, Nehemiah and Ezra. So these leaders helped with the rebuilding of the nation. And finally, he touched the hearts of 4 non-Jewish kings, and I will tell you more about that. That is the most unbelievable part. Can God compel non-Jewish kings to do good to a Jewish nation? Can a country that is not Christian make laws that help Christian work? So this is the list of the major prophets, the minor prophets, and the historical prophets. And I want you to know that these prophets are compressed in 150 years timeline. Normally, there was one prophet every 200 years or 300 years. After Malachi, there was no prophet till Jesus came, 400 years. But during the exile, when the people of God suffered most intensely, it would seem that God had set up a war room in heaven and sent prophets after prophets, talking, advising, and doing things so that Israel could be rebuilt. So you can be sure that when we rebuild, God will be a very active partner, helping, managing, strategizing, and resourcing. This is what the prophet said. It was not an easy thing to convince the people of Israel. So God made sure that his communication was effective. This is what Jeremiah, he said, if you continue doing this, you will be slaves in the land of Babylon. And then Isaiah became a fool for God. He used to walk naked and barefoot, and he used to say, this is what is going to happen to you if you continue in your sin. And Ezekiel, he said, you will be eating food that is cooked on human feces. Please turn back to God. Stop the idolatry. And Jeremiah gave them words of encouragement. He said, not only will the nation be rebuilt, but the vessels will be restored. And the ark of God will be restored too. So I told you he spoke through 9 minor prophets. And the summary of what God was saying is, you have forgotten God. You have no relationship with God. You've forgotten to respect the Sabbath. Your religion is a shell. You are just about rituals. Your fasting is a ritual and your sackcloth is a ritual. You think you can make a contract with me. Because you do this, I will do that. But you don't have any relationship with me. You have forgotten me. That is the most important message. The other things that the prophet said was, you are immersed in idolatry and immorality. There is severe justice in oppression and iniquity. And then he also gave them words of comfort and encouragement. So this is what the prophet said. Now we need also prophets. We have to have mentors today in the church. We need to have people who preach, who teach, who disciple, who teach people how to live well, so that they can be the rebuilding process. God moved the heart of 4 non-Jewish kings. This is the most extraordinary part. 4 Persian monarchs issued 4 decrees. How could this happen? They did not know Yahweh. They had no understanding about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they became servants of God and they issued decrees, very, very compelling decrees. The first decree was by Cyrus the Great. How that happened, let me just tell you how that happened. Isaiah 45:1, it says, to Cyrus I take hold of his right hand to subdue nations for the sake of my servant Jacob. Now this prophecy was 150 years before Cyrus was born. Isaiah prophesied that Cyrus will take hold of my right hand and will subdue nations, and he will serve my servant Jacob. And so what happened was, this book of Isaiah was written down by his scribe, and Daniel had this book. And when Daniel was taken as a slave prisoner to Babylon, he had this book with him. And he must have wondered who this Cyrus is that Isaiah is talking about. And he probably was waiting for someone like Cyrus to come along. And then Cyrus came along very suddenly. There was Belshazzar, who was drinking wine, and there was the writing on the wall, Mene Mene Tekel Uparsin, and you've been weighed and you've been found wanting, and then he died. And then overnight, that night, Cyrus with his army came through the aqueduct and completely overtook, without firing a shot, he completely took over Babylon. And then Daniel must have thought, yeah, this is the Daniel Isaiah was prophesying about. And so Daniel must have shown Cyrus, saying, see, our prophets have prophesied 150 years before you came, and he said that you're going to win, you're going to subdue all the nations, and you're going to help my servant Jacob, that is Israel. And Cyrus must have been greatly moved, and he must have had faith in the God of Israel. And he pronounced an edict. What did the edict say? First of all, he said, just look at the things that I've underlined. He has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. This is what Cyrus says. And then he says, you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah. He wanted them to go back. He freed them. And then he said, I will provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with free will offering for the temple of God in Jerusalem. This was the first edict, and that was a real miracle. And then people went back, they started rebuilding the city, but the Samaritans came and they wrote a letter after Cyrus had died. They wrote a letter to the Persian king, Ahasuerus, and he said, these Jews are rebuilding the rebellious and evil city and are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. So Ahasuerus issued a temporary stay, like a stay order. He said the city may not be rebuilt until another decree may be issued by him, because I want to think about it. So it was temporarily stopped. Then Haggai came in and encouraged the people and said, don't be worried, things will change, you start rebuilding again. Haggai says, you have stopped rebuilding the temple and now you're only rebuilding your houses. That is not going to help. You are not going to prosper if you do that. Build the temple again and God will undertake. So they began to rebuild, and they wrote another letter, and Darius issued another decree saying, continue rebuilding. And so 4 decrees happened, one by one. Darius reaffirmed and expedited the order of Cyrus. And this is what he said: if any man violates this edict, a timber shall be drawn from his house and he'll be impaled on it. Such a definitive decree. Everybody was afraid, and they allowed the Jews to do whatever they wanted. And he said, may the God who has caused his name to dwell there. So even Darius was convinced about the reality of the living God. And then after that, King Artaxerxes gave an extraordinary decree. He said, you can now be free. You are not anymore under our authority. You are given complete autonomy. You make your own laws, and you don't have to pay, they had to pay some money every year, like lots of silver and lots of gold. He said, you don't have to pay anything more. You are free. You can govern your own nation. This is what he told Ezra. And he said, Ezra, you make the laws and let people listen to you, and I'm making you the leader, and you are now independent. So these are the 4 edicts for repair. Artaxerxes gave them independence, and the final edict, Artaxerxes gave a letter to Nehemiah to rebuild the wall. And so what the 4 edicts that the Persian kings gave for rebuilding of the city. And so this is why the psalmist says, why do the heathen rage and imagine a vain thing? The heathen think that, in our own country, there were many people there was one person who made a speech. He said, if there is anyone who can destroy these Christian churches and stop this conversion, it is our party. And so he was thundering that. And I thought, why are the heathen raging and imagining vain thing? God will see to it that the kingdom of God is established in this nation. And then God used these 3 people to manage the enemies: Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Ezra managed the danger of foreign women bringing in idolatry. Esther managed Haman, and it's a story in itself. And Nehemiah managed the Samaritans, Sanballat and Tobiah and their gang, so that the work of reconstruction was done. And God raised up leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua, Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah, who did what they had to do in the rebuilding process. So we can see how God oversaw the rebuilding of the nation of Israel. The 3 things that were rebuilt, there was the temple that was rebuilt, Zerubbabel, Haggai and Zechariah were involved in it. And then the people were reformed in their hearts, and Ezra was responsible for that. And Nehemiah got the wall rebuilt. So these are the three main things that we need to rebuild in our country. Rebuild the temple, that means establish a relationship with God, disciple people. And what does the wall mean? The temple rebuilding is planting a worship group in a community. Rebuilding the city is teaching the law and discipleship training and education and culture that flows from a Christian worldview. And building the wall, what does that actually mean? Any of you? Building the wall means justice. And that's such an integral part of what God is saying in the Old Testament that most of the Christians have missed this understanding. The city gate was the center of justice. When Boaz wanted to marry Ruth, a lot of legal hurdles had to be overcome. And so they sat at the city gate where the elders met and managed the legal formalities. And Amos says, I hate the evil, love the good, and establish justice in the city gate. Isaiah says, he will give a spirit of justice to those who judge. He will give strength to those who defend the city gates in battle. So the city gate was the center of justice. And when Nehemiah built the city walls, it is about establishing justice in a nation. So these are the threefold application in the context of Israel. That was what Isaiah 58 was all about. We have to translate that in the context of our country, and we look forward to that in the kingdom of God. Rebuilding involves a lot of suffering. Amos was excommunicated by King Amaziah and later on martyred by Amaziah's son. Isaiah was sawn asunder by King Manasseh. Jeremiah suffered exclusion and persecution and kept in a dungeon and finally killed in Egypt. Ezekiel suffered martyrdom in the land of the Chaldeans. Micah suffered martyrdom by King Jehoram. And so this is what Jesus says, laments in Matthew, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to you. It was rebuilding process meant a lot of suffering. So if we think that rebuilding is only about strategy, we are mistaken. It will mean a lot of suffering for which we have to be prepared, a lot of persecution, and a lot of that is already happening in North India. The silence of God. Why was God silent? Chapter 58 starts off with that. It says, we fasted and we put on sackcloth and we prayed and you are silent. What's happening, Lord? And finally, Isaiah says, he tells them, there were three things why God was silent. You did not have a relationship with me. You had a contractual relationship with me. That means you go to a shop, you give the money, and he gives you something. He says, you can't have a contractual relationship with me. And then another reason what God was silent was pointing of the finger. That means you were not taking responsibility. You are putting the blame on somebody else. Bad things were happening and you were not taking any responsibility. You were leaders, but you did not intervene. And they were practicing oppression, injustice, and equity. And this is the reason why God was silent. This is the contractual relationship. Okay, the current context in our country is there is severe injustice and inequity. GDP has grown, but the per capita income is the lowest in 20 years. What does that mean? That means some people are becoming very rich, and the nation as a whole, the GDP is increased, but the per capita income has decreased. Unemployment has doubled in the last 10 years. Healthcare spending is extremely low. 75 million people have gone below the poverty line. And 25% of children who have finished 10th standard cannot read. This is a survey from Pratham Foundation. You will not find that from the government sources. The tertiary care and primary care, tertiary care and private care is being built up at the expense of primary and secondary care, and inequality is the highest in 100 years. There is a database called World Inequality Index. They use what is called Gini coefficient, and they are actually very good. And they have found that in India, the inequality is the highest in the last 100 years. That means a nation's prosperity is not judged by the GDP, it is judged by the inequality index. And if you judge by the inequality index, our country is probably the worst off in the last 100 years. And then this is a quotation from Lancet. It is now well established that the more unequal the society, the worse the outcomes for all, including people at the top. That means if there is inequality, even wealthy people will suffer serious consequences. Like what? Now there is evidence for all that. Children will have children. That means teen pregnancies will increase. People from well-to-do families will go to jail. People from well-to-do families will have psychological problems. They will drop out from school. Families of well-to-do will break up, and there will be anti-social behavior from the well-to-do children. That means shooting, all those mysterious shootings that are happening, which have no explanation, is because of iniquity and inequality. Now, what is iniquity and what is equality? Now, if you look at this picture, everyone has got a stool which is of the same size, and the tall boy can see very well, but the boy who is short, who's got the same size stool, cannot see anything. But if the tall boy gives his stool to the short boy, then all of them will see. So this is not equality, but it is equity. Now, equity is what the Bible wants. The Bible does not want equality. That means it expects people who have more to give to people who don't have, because then you're establishing equity. Is it in the Bible? Yes. If you look at the Jubilee principle, slaves were released. Now, releasing the slaves was a big loss. You keep a slave, you teach him, and he's become skilled, and then after 7 years or after 49 years, you release him. So you've lost a lot of money. But this is what God wanted, because God wanted to create an equitable society. Forgiveness of debt. You take a debt, and then at the end of 7 years or 49 years, debt is forgiven. So that's a big loss. But God wanted that. Repatriation of property of the land that was mortgaged, God wanted it back in the Jubilee year. So the Jubilee year is the evidence that God wants equity, not equality. And this is what the church is called to do because of the inequality that exists in the country today, because that is an important part of the rebuilding process in our nation. In summary, I talked to you about rebuilding the temple. That means starting worshipping groups in every community. I talked to you about rebuilding the city. That means discipleship, teaching them how to live well, based on Christian ethos, education, livelihood, and then finally city gates, which means justice. So if we do these three things, we can rebuild a nation. So that was about repairing the breach in this country. I hope we can translate that for our nation, for our church, and for our own lives. Thank you.